Hello, and welcome to Same Crime, Different Time. I'm Jennifer Chambers. You know that I'm passionate about uncovering the truth. Here, we're taking that passion to the dark heart of the Pacific Northwest. As a true crime and historical writer, I've spent years immersed in the chilling archives of this region. Each week, we'll explore cases, both ancient and modern, of murder, unexplained events, strange places, and those who have simply vanished. We'll dig into the research, connecting the dots between past and present, revealing the threads of mystery that weave through our incredible, yet often unsettling, landscape. Prepare to be captivated as we discover that while times may change, the darkest aspects of human nature remain hauntingly the same. When you hear the sound of a train rolling through the night, it might stir a sense of wanderlust, or it might stir a longing for another place and time. But for a community of rail riders, drifters, or transient workers, people who were unhoused, these boxcars weren't just transportation. They were shelter and home, escape. But for 15 years, the rails also became the hunting ground of a serial killer. A man who blended into his surroundings not just because he was invisible, but because he chose to live where others looked away. They called him Sidetrack. They called him the Boxcar Killer. But he had a name few in law enforcement had ever heard until it was too late: Robert Joseph Silveria Jr. This is the story of violence on the rails, of lives lived in the margins, and of how a determined detective changed the course of a long-forgotten trail of bodies in the boxcars. This is Same Crime, Different Time. I'm your host, Jen Chambers. Let's pull back the curtain. Part 1. Who was Robert Joseph Silveria Jr.? He was born March 3rd, 1959, in Redwood City, California. From the outside, it may have looked like any other drifter who was riding freight lines. But by the early 1980s, his life would take a darker turn. For many years, he crisscrossed the western United States on the rails, riding boxcars and living a transient lifestyle that blurred the line between freedom and survival. Eventually, he became associated with a loosely organized group of riders who shared resources, and they guarded their own code of conduct. This was a group called the Freight Train Riders of America. And it was very loosely organized. But beneath the camaraderie and the myth of the road was something far more violent. Silveria wasn't just riding the rails, he was using them to hunt. Part 2, Community on the Margins. To understand the Boxcar Killer, we need to understand the people that he preyed upon, and that means stepping into a world most of us never see. I'm very interested in this. Across America from the 80s to the 90s, a community of transient rail riders that called themselves boxcar riders, from the things that I've read. Now, this is all from what I've read. I've never been. I've known a lot of people who have done that. It was very daring to do when I was in high school and early college, but I was always terrified. Part of it was the areas, right? People who lived on freight lines and in the camps. It was scary. It wasn't a place that I wanted to be. A lot of these people were unhoused by circumstance, job loss, addiction, mental health challenges, fractured families, or they were simply shut out of stable opportunities because of the places and times that they lived. But there was a huge community. These people's survival depended on mutual trust and vigilance. Now, in the past, these people had also called themselves bulls, or junglers, or trek rats. These are all from documentation that I have read. Some of these people rode the rails for work. Other people's because they had wanderlust, right? But they all were people with names and histories and families. They weren't just headlines. but it's not really recorded. And society frequently treated their deaths differently when they did die. A body beside a rail line wasn't always investigated too deeply. Some of these deaths were dismissed as accidents or suicides, or cases where there were no humans involved. This is coded language that erased the fact that another human had died far from safety or shelter. And people took advantage. There's bad people in every group, but Robert Silveria exploited these blind spots. He didn't just travel the rails. He got himself really deeply embedded in a community that rarely made the news, but whose lives were deeply interconnected. It was kind of a perfect breeding ground for him to do awful things. Part 3, the crimes begin. Now, Silveria's killing spree spanned more than a decade, and through multiple states. From California to Oregon, Utah, Kansas, Montana, and Florida. There were confirmed killings and many other suspected deaths who were tied to his confessions, and some possessions that he had at the time of his arrest that were recovered. He came to my knowledge. I was reading a book called Murderland by Caroline Fraser, which is a fantastic book. And she was talking about some of the, first of all, it's an incredible book that is well worth reading, and talking about the preponderance of serial killers in areas, particularly on the West Coast, but areas that were rife with environmental pollution. And it's really a very, very worthy theory. I think that she's right on. But she had mentioned the Boxcar Killer in her notes afterwards, and so I had to learn more about him. And I learned about him because his first known murder occurred in Salem, Oregon, on December 1st, 1995. This was when the body of a man named William Avis Pettit Jr., who was 39, was discovered in a boxcar in Millersburg, outside of Salem, Oregon. Pettit had been bludgeoned to death, and his possessions were missing. And 2 days later, a man named Michael Andrew Kleitz, who was 24, he was found dead in Portland, in a railway area, also bludgeoned similarly. Soon after, Silveria was picked up, and they found items that didn't belong to him on his person. He had backpacks and ID cards and food stamps that belonged to those two victims, Pettit Jr. and Kleitz. Evidence of theft as well as violence. Silveria confessed to these murders, but the trail didn't stop in Oregon. He later admitted to killings in the other states. Willie James Clark, who was 54, in Tallahassee, Florida, had been bludgeoned in 1994. Darren Royal Miller, who was 19, was found dead near Thompson Springs, Utah in 1992. Roger Lee Bauman, 38, from Salt Lake City, Utah. Charles Randall Boyd, 46, from Kansas. And Paul Wayne Matthews, 43, outside of Whitefish, Montana. So the list continued to grow. Silveria kept speaking with law enforcement after he was arrested. He was sometimes speaking voluntarily, sometimes he was interrogated. And eventually the detectives noticed a pattern. Silveria often attacked people when the victims were asleep, or when they were intoxicated or otherwise vulnerable. He took advantage of them using blunt objects or stabbing them with weapons that he improvised at the time. Part 4, Motivations and Missed Signs. When we talk about motivations in cases that intersect with houselessness or transient life, we have to tread carefully too often because analysis of these things, and I've read a bunch of them, they slip into stereotypes, and it diminishes the victims or excuses the perpetrators. But in Silveria's case, his own statements and some accounts from law enforcement suggest that he talked about his violence being justified because he was angry at the people around him. In some of the earlier statements, some of his acquaintances said that he talked about his rage and that his rage got easier and easier after the first time he killed someone. But the context doesn't really explain, it just helps frame it. Silveria was a person who had violence within him for whatever reason, and the rails were his chosen environment. And these victims were people with little social visibility, so they made easy targets. The broader systems that failed these victims, their lack of shelter, inadequate social services, the fragmented law enforcement communication, helped contribute to how long it took for this recognition of his pattern to come out. Of course, the responsibility for the violence always lies with the person who commits it. But it's just kind of interesting. It's interesting. I've been around people who traveled on the rails, and they seemed to really like it. But I don't know, I never really questioned anyone very deeply. It's a very many-faceted problem, right? People who live down there. Part 5, Arrest and Confession. So when Silveria was finally arrested on March 2nd, 1996, he was in a rail yard in Roseville, California. He was pinched after a railroad police spotted him during a routine check. I can't imagine how scary that would be. Silveria's nickname was Sidetrack, which was kind of, from what I've read, a nod to the sidings and the spurs where the freight trains wait, and where he often waited to hop on. At the time of his arrest, like I said, they found a whole bunch of personal items from the people that he had attacked on him, and it linked him to murders across a bunch of different states. So, faced with that, in January of 1998, he pleaded guilty to the murders of Pettit and Kleitz in Oregon. And this allowed him to avoid the death penalty and instead get 2 consecutive life sentences. People who were authorities in other places, including Kansas and Florida, they tried to extradite him for additional charges, and some of them were pursued, and others are documented still in confessions and evidence. Part 6. Community impact. Like I talked about a little bit briefly, but these men were real people. They weren't statistics. They were fathers and brothers and friends and members of this community that's often ignored by society and overlooked by media. I mean, the only media I can think of is negative regarding people. I'm not saying it's an ideal way to live, but I'm saying these people are living there because they either want to or they have to, and I'm not here to judge that, but there's definitely a society there, and it's not all bad, I would imagine. All I can think of is, movies like Trainspotting. I'm not saying it's good, but these people shared this similar marginalization, whether it was by choice or circumstance. But I imagine they shared more than that vulnerable living situation. They shared stories of their survival and hardship. They were people that had ambitions and love. I don't know. I knew a man named Ray. He was mentally ill, and I was in contact with him through a couple of people I know, and also I used to give free books to people who lived outside. I would go down weekly with a big peach cart. This was sponsored by the Eugene Public Library. And I would go down to our downtown mall where people lived outside often or would travel to and give them books, because I felt like everybody's life can be a little bit better with a book. And I was very happy that they were able to sponsor that program so that I could do that. And so I met a man named Ray, and he was a nice man. He had his demons. But I know that the people that he was with, it was a very tight community. They were just ordinary people that lived in different circumstances because of the things that were happened in their lives. And people who knew this man, Silveria, said that he seemed like a normal guy. He didn't seem different at first. As I researched this, I mean, it was incredibly sad to think about all that people whom he took advantage of. But it also helped remind me about the humanity of people who live rough and people who live in different ways than I live. The story of the Boxcar Killer reminds us that when violence intersects with blind spots of society, marginalization and houselessness and transient life, the darkness only makes it flourish more. It's really great. The city of Eugene does a memorial once a year for people who die during the year who were homeless. I don't have solutions for it, but I think that their lives and their deaths are just as important to recognize as anyone. And just incredibly sad that these marginalized pieces of society get taken advantage of more than others. If you have thoughts about this episode or leads about another case or others like it, reach out to me at scdtpod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. I'm Jen Chambers. This has been Same Crime, Different Time. Stay curious and stay compassionate. We tell these stories so the people behind them are never forgotten. I'll have the sources on my Instagram page at j_b_chambers. I'll also have just kind of interesting and fun, something that I looked at as I was researching this. There was a language that people starting in the late 1800s popularized all the way up through the 40s, maybe up until the 60s. And I think it's still there. But the railway terms, the languages that people used of people who were riding the rails, I'll have a list of those terms. I think it's fascinating, and it's another part of what makes a society, what makes a community, a shared language. Some of the things they have are flipping is to board a moving train. A flop is a place to sleep. The jungle is a secluded wooded area near the rail yards where people camp. The bulls were the railway police. A hot shot was a fast freight train. A deadhead was a train or a car with no cargo. CH&D is cold, hungry, and dry. There were also symbols, excuse me, that were used on the rails. They used chalk to mark fences and buildings or water towers with simple symbolic messages that warned or informed other passengers on the railway. And I think those are especially interesting. There was a circle with an X that meant good food, or you could get a handout. A horizontal zigzag, like a lightning bolt, was danger. Or some places I read that it said barking dog. 3 diagonal lines was not a safe place. I just think these are so interesting and important for people's safety, for one thing, which I would imagine is a huge thing living down there. But I think sociologically, everybody's, like I say, is worthy of interest and respect. So I'll have a list of those terms and my sources and things like that on my Instagram, j_b_chambers on Instagram. Sorry, I digressed. Once again, thank you so much for being with me today. I'll see you next week.
Thanks for listening today. Please review and rate wherever you listen to podcasts. That really helps out the show. And please leave us a voicemail at the Spotify link. Also, you can always feel free to send us an email at scdtmail@gmail.com or www.jennifer-chambers.com.